There are some lives that become part of our own story. The music, the moments, the memories, they're so deeply stitched into our culture. It feels like they've always been there, and always will be. For over 6 decades, one man has been a giant of popular music, a seemingly bottomless well of melody and optimism. Paul McCartney. His songs have been the soundtrack to first loves, to changing worlds, and to quiet Sunday mornings. We see him on stage, even now in his 80s, charming thousands like it's second nature, a living legend who seems to have outsmarted time itself. But behind those timeless hits, and that familiar, boyish grin, there's a much more complicated story. It's a life marked by profound, soul-crushing loss and private struggles that would have broken most people. The joy he's shown the world has often been a brave face for a deep and lasting sorrow he's carried since he was just a boy. What happens when the music stops? For more than 60 years, Paul McCartney has been the world's soundtrack. But behind the legendary success and sold-out stadiums lies a story of profound loss and private battles few really get. At over 83 years old, how does a man who gave the world so much joy cope with his own quiet heartbreak? It's a somber journey through devastating loss, crippling depression, and the ghosts of the past that still join him on stage every night. This isn't just the story of a Beatle. It's the story of a man who has faced unimaginable loss and the far from sad reality of how he lives with it today. To understand the quiet sadness that has followed Paul McCartney his entire life, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a wound so deep it would shape everything that came after. Before the screaming crowds, before global fame, he was just a boy in Liverpool. A boy named James Paul McCartney, whose world revolved around his mother, Mary. Mary McCartney was a midwife, a kind and capable woman who was the family's anchor. She was the main breadwinner, her steady income giving the family a slice of working-class comfort in post-war Liverpool. Paul remembers her vividly, a figure of strength and warmth, riding her bike through snowy streets at 3 in the morning to deliver babies. She was the one who pushed her boys to speak properly, representing stability and hope in their lives. In the bustling McCartney home, Mary was the sun everything orbited. And then, suddenly, she was gone. In October 1956, when Paul was just 14, his mother died. She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer, but in a time when such things were only spoken about in whispers, the children were mostly kept in the dark. He didn't really even know what she had died from at first. All he knew was that his mother went into the hospital for an operation and never came back. She died of an embolism, a complication from the surgery. She was only 7, that the shock was immediate and confusing. Paul recalls the moment he and his younger brother Michael were told the news. Overwhelmed and unsure how to handle the massive grief, he blurted out a thoughtless, defensive joke. "What are we going to do without her money?" It was a remark that would haunt him with guilt for the rest of his life. Later, alone, the full weight of it all crushed him. He prayed, promising God he'd be good if only she could return, but she couldn't. The worst part, he would later say, was seeing his stoic father, Jim, break down. He'd hear his dad crying in another room at night, a sound that shook his faith in everything. A silence fell over the house where Mary's warmth used to be. The family, in the stiff pupper-lip style of the era, simply didn't talk about it. That loss became a defining, unspoken trauma. It was common ground he would later find with another young, grieving musician from Liverpool named John Lennon, whose own mother would be tragically killed just a couple of years later. This shared wound, this shattering of their teenage worlds, formed a deep, almost psychic bond between them. It was a foundational crack in McCartney's life, a loss, he admitted, in his later years he never got over. He coped by throwing himself into music. His interest in the guitar became a full-blown obsession. It was a way to channel the pain, to build a world he could control. One of the very first songs he ever wrote was a simple tune called "I Lost My Little Girl." The meaning, he later admitted, was obvious. He was already trying to turn his heartbreak into art. This first great sorrow would echo through his life. Years later, during the chaotic final days of the Beatles, when he felt lost and overwhelmed, his mother came to him in a dream. She appeared, calm and reassuring, and spoke the simple words that would become his most famous hymn of comfort, "Let it be." It was a message from the ghost who had never left him, a reminder of the first and most profound sadness that would set the stage for a lifetime of grappling with loss. If his mother's death was the private wound that shaped the boy, the breakup of the Beatles was the public execution of the man's identity. For a decade, being a Beatle wasn't just a job, it was everything. It was a brotherhood forged in the fire of unbelievable fame, a creative partnership that had redrawn the map of modern culture. They were, as Paul himself said, like army buddies who had been through a war together. And then, in 1970, it was over. For Paul McCartney, the silence was deafening. The end wasn't a clean break, it was a slow, painful unraveling. The cracks had been forming for years. The pressure of being the most famous people on earth, business arguments, and creative differences all took their toll. John Lennon, pulling away with Yoko Ono, had privately announced he wanted a divorce in 1969. but it was Paul who was left to take the public fall for the split. Filing a lawsuit to dissolve their partnership, a move he made to protect their work from a controversial manager, but one that publicly pitted him against his bandmates. The aftermath almost broke him. He retreated with his new wife, Linda, and their young family to a remote farm in Scotland, and there, he fell apart. The man who had been the optimistic engine of the Beatles was now lost. He's spoken frankly about this dark time, revealing a despair fans could never have imagined. "I was depressed," he admitted bluntly. "You would be. You were breaking from your lifelong friends." He didn't know if he'd even make music again. How do you follow the Beatles? The question was paralyzing. He started drinking heavily, finding comfort in whiskey. "I took to the bevies," he said. "It was great at first, then suddenly I wasn't having a good time. It wasn't working." He struggled to get out of bed, feeling totally useless, stripped of his purpose and his closest friends. The sense of loss was complete. He'd lost his family, his entire identity. Making things worse, the private bitterness between him and John exploded into public view, turning their albums into battlegrounds. It was a nasty war of words. Paul took a veiled shot on his album Ram with the song Too Many People, singing Too Many People preaching practices, which he later said was a little dig at John and Yoko's public activism. John's response was a brutal, direct assault. In his song, How Do You Sleep? He sang with searing cruelty. "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day." The lyrics viciously dismissed Paul's entire post-Beatles work. He even mocked Paul's gift for melody with the line, "The sound you make is music to my ears." It was a devastating blow from the man who was once his other half. Paul described, "Hearing John's attacks, John was firing missiles at me with his songs, and one or two of them were quite cruel. I don't know what he hoped to gain, other than punching me in the face." This was perhaps the lowest point of McCartney's life. He was isolated, drinking, fighting, depression, and being publicly shredded by his former best friend. The dream that had carried him out of Liverpool to the top of the world had become a nightmare. The joy of the Beatles was replaced by lawsuits, feuds, and a deep, personal despair. He was lost in the wilderness, and it would take a powerful force to pull him back. That force was Linda. Just as he was sinking into a bog of depression and booze on his Scottish farm, Paul McCartney found his lifeline. Linda Eastman, the American photographer he'd married in March 1969, simply refused to let him disappear into his grief. She was his anchor in the storm, giving him a reason to get up in the morning. Seeing him so lost, she was the one who, gently but firmly, said, "You've got to get it together." She believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. It was Linda who encouraged him to start over. And starting over meant building a new family, both personally and musically. He decided to form a new band, not on the world-changing scale of the Beatles, but on the simple idea of being together. He wanted his wife by his side, so he taught her to play keyboards, and together, they formed Wings. Critics scoffed at the legendary Paul McCartney, starting a band with his amateur wife. But Paul didn't care. He wasn't trying to replace the Beatles, he was trying to save himself. They were famously inseparable, rarely spending a night apart for nearly 30 years. Wings became his salvation. It was a rocky start, playing small, unannounced college gigs, and traveling in a van, but it was exactly what he needed. It was a return to basics, to the joy of just playing music without the crushing weight of a legacy. Eventually, Wings found its footing and then took off, becoming one of the biggest bands of the 1970s with massive hits like Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, and silly love songs. Paul was back. He'd found a new life, a new purpose, all built around the love and stability Linda gave him. She was, he said, the love of his life. For a while, it seemed the darkness was gone for good. But the cruelest tragedies often hit when life seems fullest. In 1995, the perfect world Paul had built with Linda was shattered by 3 words: breast cancer. It was the same disease that had taken his mother 4 decades earlier, a nightmarish echo of his first great loss. For the next 3 years, they fought it together, a time Paul later called a nightmare. Linda, always brave, never complained, and held on to hope. Paul was by her side through it all, a devoted caregiver to the woman who had saved him. In an act of protective love, he and her doctor decided not to tell her that the illness was terminal. He wanted her to live without the shadow of death hanging over her head. And she did. The day before she died, she was out riding her horse, her greatest passion. Linda McCartney died on April 17, 1998, at 56 years old. Paul was holding her, surrounded by their children. He whispered her to sleep, telling her, "You're up on your beautiful Appaloosa stallion. It's a fine spring day. We're riding through the woods. The bluebells are all out, and the sky is clear blue." Before he could finish, she closed her eyes and was gone. The grief was absolute. The man who had weathered the breakup of the world's biggest band was now broken by a loss that was infinitely deeper. "I think I cried for about a year, on and off," he later confessed. You expect to see them walk in, this person you love, because you are so used to them. I cried a lot. It was almost embarrassing, except it seemed the only thing to do. For the second time in his life, Paul had lost the central woman in his world to cancer. The light she had brought into his life went out, and he was plunged back into a familiar, devastating darkness. Paul McCartney has turned so much of his pain into beautiful music that has helped millions. Which Paul McCartney or Beatles song means the most to you, and why? Share your story in the comments below. It's a testament to his art that his personal journey has become a part of so many of our own. As Paul grappled with the private, gut-wrenching grief of losing Linda, the ghosts of his past were never far. The complex, fractured, but ultimately deep bond he shared with John Lennon was a wound that had started to heal, only to be torn open in the most brutal way. Thankfully, the bitter feud of the early 70s had faded. By the middle of the decade, Paul and John had found their way back to being friends. The phone calls were no longer hostile. They talked not as warring icons, but as old pals, as fathers. They talked about normal things, like baking bread. Paul later expressed huge gratitude for this, saying, "I was really grateful that we got it back together before he died, because it would have been very difficult to deal with it was very difficult anyway." They lived as if they had all the time in the world. Then came December 8, 1980. The news of John Lennon's murder in New York City sent a shockwave across the planet. For Paul, it was a personal devastation he couldn't process. He remembered seeing people on TV trying to summarize what John meant, and he just couldn't do it. "I can't just go on TV and say what John meant to me," he thought. "It was just too deep. It's just too much. I couldn't put it into words." When reporters ambushed him on the street, he was in a state of pure shock. His mumbled, seemingly casual reply, "It's a drag," was widely criticized as cold, but it was the reflex of a man so shattered he couldn't find his real emotions. Later, back home, he sat with his children and cried all evening. The loss was, as he would say 40 years later, so senseless. When asked how he was processing the murder after all that time, his answer was heartbreaking. "I'm not sure I am. I occasionally will have thoughts and sort of say, I don't know. Why don't I just break down crying every day? Because it's that bad." The only way he knew how to truly talk to John was with a song. In a quiet studio, he wrote "Here Today." It wasn't a tribute. It was a conversation, a direct message to his lost friend. He put all the things he never got to say into the lyrics. The song asks, "And if I say I really knew you well, what would your answer be?" It explores their arguments and, most importantly, contains the 3 words he could never bring himself to say to John in person: "I love you." Performing that song remains an emotional tightrope walk for him. He's admitted that on every tour, the song will just get him, and he breaks down, overcome by the memory of the great mate he misses so deeply. The list of losses wasn't over. In November 2001, another pillar of his life fell when George Harrison died after his own battle with cancer. The quiet Beatle, the group's spiritual little brother, was gone. Now, it was just Paul and Ringo. The weight of the Beatles' legacy, once shared by 4, now rested almost entirely on his shoulders. He was becoming one of the last men standing, a living monument to a time and a bond that could never be recreated. So we come back to the question, at over 83 years old, is Paul McCartney's life truly sad? If you only look at it through the lens of loss, the answer seems to be yes. This is a man who lost his mother as a boy, his creative other half to an assassin, his soulmate to a cruel disease, and another brother-in-arms to that same illness. He has survived public ridicule, private depression, and the crushing pressure of being a living legend. These threads of sorrow aren't just in his past, they are part of his present. When he takes the stage on tour now, the ghosts are right there. With him, using modern technology, he performs a virtual duet of "I've Got a Feeling" with John, singing alongside footage from the 1969 rooftop concert. He finds these moments of connection incredibly emotional, telling audiences "That's so special for me. I know it's virtual, but come on, it's John, we're back together." But to call his life sad is to miss the most incredible part of his story completely. Recent false rumors about his health and tour cancellations, often fueled by AI-generated images, have caused waves of concern among fans, but the reality is the opposite. As of 2025, he is actively touring North America, playing marathon shows that last nearly 3 hours. Reviews from recent years consistently describe his energy as astonishing, with one calling him a raw and relatable 5-star triumph who gives off the vibe of someone 20 years younger. His life today isn't a tragedy. It's a masterclass in resilience. The sadness isn't the defining feature. It's the foundation for his strength. The joy he brings to millions is made more profound, not less, by the heartbreaks he's endured. He carries the immense weight of his past onto that stage every night, stands beside his ghosts, and still manages to sing songs of love and hope. So, is his life sad? A better word is profound. It's a life lived with the full, aching knowledge of what has been lost, and a courageous, relentless decision to keep living, keep creating, and keep giving. The quiet heartbreak is real, but the music, the joy, and the spirit of Paul McCartney are, against all odds, so much louder. What Paul McCartney song has helped you through a difficult time? Let us know in the comments below. And for more stories about the legends of music and the lives behind the hits, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.